Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining me on this Tuesday morning if you're live with us, and thank you for joining me later on if you don't manage to watch it live. My name's Tim. I'm the curate at St Mary's Becontree, and it's my great pleasure to lead us all in a Bible study on the Book of James, and it's God and Us. That's what I've called the title of the Bible study, and we're going to be looking at James chapter 2, and there's a bit more us than God in this chapter. So we'll have to just explore what our our faith means in light of how we treat each other. I hope so. Thank you for joining me. I hope you managed to catch last week's episode. It's on our Facebook and our YouTube channel. If you want to catch up, you can. I thought I'd do a little bit of a recap on what we talked about last week, just to remind you all, in case you missed it, because a couple of things are really helpful, because I'm going to go back to them a bit later on. So if we just have a look. So I've called James chapter 2 Favouritism and Faith, and I'll explain that a little bit later on. But like I said, we're going to do a bit of a recap. Last week I showed you the Charlie Brown cartoon, and there's Linus there who's gone to a Bible study, and he admits he feels a bit guilty, and he says the killer line, I always feel like I'm reading someone else's mail. And when we read books of the New Testament particularly, that's what we're doing. We shouldn't feel guilty about it. We feel privileged that we've got the opportunity to read a conversation, a one-sided conversation between someone and a bunch of Christians. So we've got that privilege. So remember, we are prying when we read the Book of James, and that's a really good prying, a healthy exploration, if you like. And then last week I talked about a little bit about the audience, and James chapter 1 verse 1 talks about he's writing to the scattered Christians, and they've been scattered through persecution, probably through persecution. We think it could have been a famous Christian at the time, or one of the Christian leaders called Stephen was martyred. He was stoned to death, and that meant all the Christians had to flee. So so Christians fled. They became essentially became asylum seekers throughout the land, and so this book of James is written to Christians who turning up in towns and cities looking for work, being ostracized, having lost their homes, very little income, if at all, so a real tough time for the church. So just bear that in mind. And I asked you to put on lenses. I showed you a picture. I had some of my wife's sunglasses, and I asked you to think about people that who have been marginalised, and try and think about this letter in the light of people who have been marginalised, and that might change a little bit of the narrative, change a little bit of the story for you. So please try to think about people that might feel marginalised, might feel left out or because of different reasons, but just try to remember that in your mind. So in a short summary, if you're of chapter 1, if you're a Christian facing a difficult situation, you're on the right path. James said, try to look through your trial. You're going to get through this. I'm there. I'm with you. I love you. I care for you. That's why I'm writing you this letter. I'm there. But in your trial, ask for wisdom. And then talked about not getting angry. And that won't help you in your oppression, in your frustration. And don't forget that first faith. And that first faith will enable you to not become like your oppressors, which is a thing we're going to kind of come back on a little bit. So that was kind of chapter 1. Before we jump into chapter 2, I'm going to just talk a little bit about the cost of a letter. But first of all, I'm going to talk about the cost of sending a WhatsApp message, the cost of sending an email for us, or the cost of sending a Facebook message. And I think we don't really think about how much it costs to send a WhatsApp message, do we? It's just, we kind of think it's free. Once you've got a smartphone, once you've downloaded the app, which is free, you can send as many messages as you like. Some people send a lot of messages on WhatsApp, and same for email. Once you've got a computer or you're using a smartphone, you can send an email, and it's kind of free. It's all built into, but communication wasn't always like that. I remember in my teenage years, before mobile phones, you had to go to a payphone, you had to put your 20p in, and when you hear the beeps, you had to scrabble around for another 20p in to put in to carry on the conversation. But if you go even further back than my teenage years, if you go back to the 1866, when that was not long after the first cable was set up between Europe and North America, to send a telegraph, it would cost a farmer, typically, if he wanted to send a one-word message from the UK to the North America, it would cost a farmer 60 days worth of food to send a one-word message across the transatlantic. So that, and you could only send a minimum of 10-word messages. So when we had that first communication between the UK and the US, communication was very expensive because it was brand new technology. But if we go even further back to the New Testament times, we see that we discover that communication was even more expensive. And some people have worked out how much it costs, because to write a New Testament epistle or letter, you'd have to usually would employ a secretary to write it. That's why Paul sometimes says, "See, I'm writing with my own hand." So most of his letters are written with a secretary, and you have to employ that person usually, and they would write a few drafts. And the paper was really expensive. It's not like you could buy a ream of paper from Ryman's. You had to make it. It was really costly. So the paper itself you'd get multiple copies. You'd have to pay a scribe. Then you have to pay someone to physically take the letter across, thousands of miles, potentially hundreds of miles. They have to get food for the journey. Had to get passage. So the cost was really exorbitant. And someone worked out there are about 18,000 words in the Book of Acts, and the equivalent today of sending the Book of Acts, it was about £18,000. So it roughly works about £1 a word. So if you're sending £1 a word, that means this message would cost about £10. Okay. So you'd be really, if you were sending a message that cost £1 a word, you'd be really careful about the words that you use. You choose your words wisely. And I want you to think about that in light of James. So this is an expensive endeavour to write a letter, but James has chosen to write a letter, and he's going to have to think very carefully about what he puts in this letter, because it costs a lot of money. So James was writing this letter, and I want you to think, when you read James or any New Testament epistle or letter, everything is there for a reason. When James says what he says, he's just not making up random musings like we might update our Facebook, just a random thought, or send a casual email to a friend, "Hey, how are you?" James was addressing serious concerns that he had, and he was willing to pay big money to address them. So everything in James is there for a reason. So I want to think about that as we think about this chapter. Favoritism and faith, that's what I've called chapter 2. There's kind of two things that we've got. So let's kind of jump in to Book of James. So I've got a picture here of Jeff Bezos, who's the founder of Amazon, and he's the most expensive person in the world. And a picture of someone who we might call homeless or vulnerably housed. And why have I got that picture? Well, James chapter 2 has one of the most striking images of James, and it's maybe if you're familiar with James, you might remember this scene. And James paints a picture of a rich man coming into their place of worship, temple, their assembly, and then the welcome is welcoming this rich man and giving them the finest seat at the front, so people could see, here's where the rich man sits, and then a poor man comes in, and the poor man is told just to sit at the back, and it's really a striking image. Here it says here. Do not show favoritism. Suppose someone comes to your meeting wearing a gold ring and fine clothes, and a poor man in filthy clothes comes in, and there James talks about showing special attention to the man wearing fine clothes, and so James paints this really vivid picture of two people coming to church, and he says, don't do that. And he kind of starts off by reminding them who they are. So it's a very, very deliberate word choice there. But my brothers and sisters, believers in our glorious Jesus Christ, must not show favoritism. So he kind of reminds them who they are and what they're about. And this, in this situation, they must not show favoritism. So when I read this passage, one quote jumped out at me, and it's from one of my favourite theologians. So it's Desmond Tutu. You can just about see in the background there. He was the Archbishop of Johannesburg during apartheid in South Africa. And he says, words to the effect of, anything that you do that causes someone to doubt that they are a child of God is evil. And I think that how those people are treating, how we show favouritism, how we send a homeless person to send at the back is doubting that they're a child of God, and Desmond Tutu said that is evil, and I think that's a really powerful image and something that strikes me. I think James is quite cross about this. This is to send someone to the back is what James says is tantamount to sin. As I've been talking to the people, as I've been talking to members of the congregation, St Mary's, about James, one thing that has been common is people love the book of James. And one of the reasons I think people love the book of James is James very much echoes the words of Christ. So we often hear the words of Christ coming through James, just slightly different, but definitely a flavour of what Jesus says. And I think that's why people like the book of James, because it's he reminds his listeners, his audience, of these words that were really important. As I said last week, this is before the Gospels were written. So people remembered the words. They didn't need to say them so much, but still in James, you still the echo of the teachings of Jesus that he remembered. Remember, we think James may have been the brother of Jesus, so these things would have been important to James as well. So in James chapter 5, he says, just following on for that image of the rich man and poor man, he says, "My dear brothers and sisters, has God not chosen those who are poor in the eyes of the world to be rich in faith and to inherit the kingdom he promised to those who love him?" And this is a common theme that Jesus talks about. And it's kind of the idea that faith comes more naturally to those on the lower end of the financial spectrum. I don't feel too qualified to talk about that because I have a house. But for this is a common biblical concept, and this thing that Paul talks about. Paul was another writer of the New Testament, and Jesus says it as well. Jesus says, "The first shall become last." And if we think about the cross, where Jesus won the victory over death, he did that by dying and by becoming. Death is surely the weakest you can be as a human being, but in that weakness, Jesus was the strongest anyone's ever been by defeating death. So those are poor in the eyes of the world actually have so much in terms of are rich in faith and are able to inherit the kingdom. That kingdom is an idea that Jesus talked about a lot. So I talked about James chapter 2, verse 6 and 7 last week, but so following on from that image, James then talks about being exploited, and it reminds us, is it not the rich who are exploiting you? You welcome these rich people into your church, but these are the rich people that are exploiting you. They're the ones that are dragging you into court. I wonder whether, that's true, whether the people that are welcoming, are being welcomed as rich people into this synagogue, into this community of Christians? Are they also the people that are exploiting them, these scattered Christians? And I don't know. We don't know whether that's actually true. But it's an idea to think about, that maybe that's why, maybe the Christians are thinking, well, if we're nice to these people, they'll stop exploiting us. I don't know. James is clear that they should not be doing that. These rich people shouldn't be exploiting you, but also you shouldn't be welcoming these rich people and disregarding the poor people. So there's a bit of a question there. So like last week, I've got some questions for reflection and some music. I've got another question here. What might you do to ensure that you do not show favoritism in your personal interactions? So think about your personal interactions, maybe your sphere of influence, where you go, where you spend a lot of your time. It might be at home right now. I spend all my time at home because my children are self-isolating at the moment, so we all have to stay indoors at the moment. So they might pop in a bit later, we don't know. But in your sphere of influence, where you have a lot of personal interactions, what might you do to ensure that you do not show favoritism? So I'll be trying to keep an eye on the comments as well. So if you want to comment, you can on Facebook now, or when you watch it, that's fine. So I'm gonna disappear for a bit to give you all some space just to think about this for the next couple of minutes. Thank you thank you for joining me. Yes, so I just gave you a chance to think about what might you do to ensure you do not show favoritism. No one's commented, but that's fine. You don't have to. We're going to move on to James chapter 6 and chapter 7 now, and let's get that up. So, that's 8 to 10. I have made yes, 8 to 10. I read the wrong cue. Sorry. Yes, we are at 8 to 10. And this is where James kind of places favoritism, puts it as sin, which is one of those tricky words to deal with. So if you show favoritism, you sin. And I was thinking about the concept of sin and the word that we use it, and your kitchen knives. Maybe you've got a kitchen knife that is your favourite. That that's what you use to chop your tomatoes, or or whatever, the more you use it, the blunter it gets, right? And if you've got one of those sharpeners, you can just sharpen it up. We used to have one on the wall when I was growing up, a knife sharpener, just to keep your knives really sharp. But the concept of the more you use something, a knife, the blunter it gets. We can also apply to words like sin. And when I mean the word becomes blunter, we lose its impact in our lives, and we assume that everyone thinks what we think about sin. It's one of those words we use a lot in church, and it's easy to have a misconception, or it's easy for its definition to be lost. So I thought we'd just, as James is talking about sin and talking about favoritism, I thought we'd just think about sin for a little bit, and maybe help define it. And one of my favourite definitions is by a lady called Barbara Brown Taylor, and she says, this is a kind of a paraphrase of what she writes. She says, sin is constantly living distantly from God. And while sins are the determined human choices sin is constantly living distantly from God, while sins are the determined human choices that maintain that distance. So anything you do that maintains that distance from God is a sin. And this sin is a deadly alienation from the source of all life that cuts us off from sustenance, community, hope, meaning, and life. So anything that in your life that cuts you off sustenance, community, hope, meaning, and life, that is sin. And I find that's quite a helpful definition, that I can do things in my life that cuts me off from hope, that cuts me off from community, and that erodes away at who I am, and that is sin. What I find helpful is that we often think of sin and punishment. If we sin, we feel there's a punishment, but often the punishment is in the sin itself. It's bound up in that. If I do something to be harmful to my community, people that I love, if destructive actions to the people that I love, actually, I'm detached from a source of life in my life, and that's, and that is part of who God is. That God is, yeah. So I think I try to have that definition of sin, that I can easily cut myself off from God and those around me, and that is sin. So when we think about Jesus on the cross, often we think that Jesus took our punishment that was due from God for our sins. Yes, Jesus bore our sins, but that sin was alienation from God, that distance from God, and that is what Jesus endured when he died. He endured that distance from God, so I think that's a helpful image to keep in our head when we think about sin. And then James starts to kind of think about a bit more about this idea of mercy, and it leads into a bit more discussion about faith. And then he talks about here, as at the end there, he says, mercy triumphs over judgment. And he does a brilliant word play before that. He says, if you don't show mercy, you will be judged. Don't show judgment, show mercy. But if you don't show mercy, then you will be judged. And I kind of like I like what he's done there with the mercy and the judgment. I think that's a really sort of helpful, image that mercy triumphs over judgment all the time. And again, I think we need to define things a little bit. I think that will make it a bit more helpful, because when we think of mercy and judgment, you think about the law courts and justice. And justice is a word that I've looked at quite a lot in my training prior to coming to Dagenham. And justice in the Old Testament is one of the most important concepts, but it's kind of a mistranslation, and it's a mistranslation of this Hebrew word called, and I have no idea how to pronounce it, so I'm just going to guess. And mishpat, I call it mishpat. I imagine the P is an H, mishpat, or no, the S is an H. Is that there's a I imagine there's an H in there somewhere. So mishpat. So that is the whenever you see justice in the Old Testament, it's probably that word, almost certainly is mishpat. But mishpat, there's no one word in the English language that does that justice. It means so much more than justice. When we think of justice, we might think of locking criminals up, or people getting what they deserve. But if you remember a speech by Martin Luther King, he quotes Amos, another prophet from the Old Testament, and there's a great image of that Amos uses of justice rolling like a mighty river. And Martin Luther King uses that phrase a lot because he was a Baptist minister, so preaching was what he did. And so he talks about justice. Martin Luther King, quoting Amos, talks about justice rolling like a mighty river, and that doesn't imply that the prisons are overflowing with people, or that all the criminals get exactly what they deserve. But it's more that justice is about the care and the protection of three groups of people, and it's always mishpat. In the Old Testament, it was always concerned with three groups of people, and those people getting what they deserve. And those were the widows, the orphans, and the aliens. And that's a frequent, those things go hand in hand in the Old Testament. By aliens, I mean refugees, foreigners, for want of a better word. But so mishpat is primarily concerned with the care of the most vulnerable. They have priority in terms of justice in the Old Testament. And I think that's kind of replicated in what James talks about in that idea of mercy triumphing over justice. He's kind of channeling that idea of mishpat that we kind of lose in our English translations and our definitions, our cultural definitions. That mishpat is that kind of justice, but justice and for the most vulnerable. So I think there's a song by a band called Radiohead, and they talk about everything being in its right place, and I think about equal opportunity for all, and for me that's justice. And mishpat is about everyone having access to amazing education, clean air, and at the moment in our society, some things are only available to those people with large amounts of wealth, or if you're a certain gender or a certain sexuality or ethnicity, then you have access to certain things that make your life better. But actually, justice means good stuff is available to all, but particularly the most vulnerable, and that's what James is concerned about, and that's what mishpat is concerned about, and that's a common biblical theme that comes up time and time and again. So it's kind of what Jesus is like saying in John 10:10 when he says, "I come that people have life and life to the full," and that is another kind of thing. So that frequently gets think about justice is that we work and we aim for that everyone has life to the full. So I've got a bit of a reflection for us to think about, and just think back about people that you might know who are suffering or who are marginalised, and what might it look like in their world if everything was in its right place? What if they had access to things that everyone had access to? What might it look like if in their world if everything was in its right place. And you can comment on Facebook an hour later, or you can just reflect on that as well. So I'm gonna vanish and. Okay, I realised there was a typo in that, and it was what might it look like in their world if everything was in the right place. So sorry about that. We're going to go on to the second section, and the final section is a lot shorter this week because I didn't have to talk so much about audience and things like that. But it's kind of what we're going to talk about next is maybe kind of the most controversial bit of James. People might be aware that there's an old theologian called Martin Luther, and he was very influential thinker, Christian thinker in I think about the 1600s, and he said famously, he said the Book of James is an epistle of straw. So it kind of like it's got no weight to it. You know, he much preferred Paul and Paul's logic and rationale and things like that. But and it's my suspicion that the kind of what we're about to discuss is probably one of the reasons why Luther said that, and it's when I say it's controversial, it's controversial in a good way, and it shows that that there's a tension in Christianity. It's not simple. There's a healthy tension between two important writers of the New Testament, and that's Paul and James, and we're going to explore that a bit later on. But just to say first that James reminds us that Christianity is a verb. So he says, what good is it, my brothers and sisters, if someone claims to have faith but has no deeds? So this is following on from the favoritism. So it's quite a nice link from this deed of sending this homeless man to sit on the floor. So what if we have faith but no deeds? Can such a faith save them? suppose a brother or sister is without clothes and daily food, and if one of you says to them, "Go in peace, keep warm, well fed," but does nothing about their physical needs, what good is it? In the same way, faith itself, if it's not accompanied by action, is dead. Wow, pretty explosive stuff from James. So he's basically saying, if you don't care for people's practical needs, your faith is dead, and that is quite controversial in light of some of the other passages in the New Testament. As I mentioned earlier, Paul was a writer of the New Testament, and he often talks about how your actions are not what justify you, and Paul often talks about belief in Jesus is what justify you, and justify you is another Christian word that I feel I have to define a little bit. By justify, I mean being in that right life-giving relationship with God. So you're in that life-giving relationship. Paul implies in a couple of his letters that he writes that being in that life-giving relationship with God is only by belief in Jesus Christ. But here James is saying, actually, being in that life-giving relationship with God is through what we do. James talks about belief being bound up in action, and it's important to remember it's both. It's not either or. It's belief and action are bound up together. For me, I take this as James reminding us that, like I said, Christianity is an action. It's a doing word. I think I said last week. Christianity, is an adventure, and if it's not an adventure, you're not doing it right. So it's an action. It's a doing. It's easy to think of Christian as a belief, as a thinking thing, and it is thinking, and it is about belief. But actually, it's turning those beliefs into action, or it's So it's how your actions and your beliefs are fueling each other. And someone once said, Paul said that humanity is justified through faith in Jesus without works of the law, but not without those works of which James speaks. Which I kind of try to both sides of the same coin. So Paul is saying that we're justified, we're made right with God through faith in Jesus without works of the law. So some of the things that Paul was talking about was circumcision, and being religious, and that reading our Bible and being seen as pious saves you. But actually, James is saying, you can do all that, but if you don't feed the hungry, actually your faith is dead. And I think they're not arguing with each other. I think they're complementing each other. But remember, they're writing to different audiences with different needs, different conversations, and so different things to be emphasised. So here, James has emphasised you've got faith, put it in action. So that's what James emphasizes. But Paul, in other letters, is saying, you've got actions, but where's your faith? You've got this appearance of Christian living, but where's your faith? So, and they're just different writers, different audiences with different emphasis, and they're not in contention. They're complementary. So I think that's what I try to keep in my mind. And the last passage that we're kind of going to discuss, I think I said in the first Bible study that James is quite a Jewish Bible book, because it was quite close to Jesus dying. It was one of the earlier books, most likely, and therefore Christianity was seen as a Jewish spin-off, and the majority of Christians were Jewish, and Christianity expanded to non-Jewish, what people call the Gentiles, a bit later on. But towards the end of James chapter 2, James uses two people to emphasize his points about this faith and action. He talks about Abraham, who you may know. He's the father of Christianity, the father of Islam, the father of Judaism. And he talks about Abraham's faith being bound up as an action. But also, intriguingly, James chooses Rahab And this is the one I want to focus on because, like I said at the beginning, everything's there for a reason, and Rahab's there for a reason. There are lots of people in the Old Testament whose faith was bound up in their action, but James chooses Rahab, and I think he does it for a specific reason. We don't know what that reason is, but we can have a guess. If you don't know the story about Rahab, she was a sex worker. And she, I think you can read in Judges chapter 2, I think it is, Joshua chapter 2. And Rahab was saved the Jewish people by harbouring some spies who were spying out the land. And then they could go back and say what was going on in the Jericho where she was living, and she was saved by putting a ribbon in a scarlet ribbon in her window, so Rahab was a sex worker who also turned out to be one of the great grandmothers of David, the greatest king that Israel had ever had, and David was also related to Jesus. So in the ancestry of Jesus, we have this character of Rahab, and it's one of those things that people often talk about: is Christianity true? Is it real? Is what you come up in the Bible? Is it authentic? What you read in the Bible, and the story of Rahab kind of reminds me that actually stuff like this is true, because if you're going to invent a religion and are going to have a founder who is divine, would you have his ancestor as a sex worker? You wouldn't, you just wouldn't write that in there. Maybe James put Rahab in it because maybe there were sex workers in his audience. Maybe James knew that people from that profession had turned to Christ, and they're in that community. We don't know, but for some reason, James chose to choose Rahab, and like I said at the start, everything in this book is there for a reason, and I think that there was a reason that James chose Rahab. We don't know. We can only guess. We just have to take a good guess. So that's kind of all I've got today. So thank you for joining me. There isn't much more to summarise today. It's more a case of remembering to don't show favouritism, but do show your faith. That's what the kind of the takeaway for James chapter 2 is. Don't show favouritism, but do show your faith. So I'll be here next week, just Tuesday the 1st of December, 11 a.m. for reflection on James chapter 3. Please leave any comments, feedback, questions below at any time, live or later on, or you can email me at tim@stmarysbecontree.org.uk. Thanks for watching, and I hopefully look forward to seeing you in person in December. But thanks for joining.